Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are on the case, investigating a mystery that plays out in university labs all over the world. What on earth keeps graduate students motivated? You know, it's a huge factor for so many brilliant minds, and honestly, figuring it out is pretty critical for the future of, well, everything. So, what really is the secret to surviving, let alone thriving, in the whole high-pressure world of graduate research? I mean, for anyone who's actually been through it, that can feel like an impossible question. But a major new investigation has just uncovered some pretty fascinating clues. We're calling this whole thing the graduate student mystery. Why? Because for decades, figuring out what truly drives students has been a really complex case. And the stakes? They couldn't be higher. The success of future innovation really depends on cracking it. Okay, so here's the core finding from this new review. It's just how direct the connection is. Turns out motivation isn't some nice-to-have extra. Nope. It is the single most important factor for success. And that has huge implications for students, for their universities, and yeah, even for the future of discovery itself. Now, every good mystery needs its detectives, right? Well, in this case, our detectives are researchers Jiyoung Han and Yahui Wang. And their method wasn't just to, interview with you students. No, they launched a massive investigation, a systematic review of all the evidence collected over decades. And when I say the scope of their investigation was huge, I mean it. Our detectives analyzed the findings from 57 different studies on this topic. This was no small-scale operation. It was a super deep dive into an enormous pool of data, all to find the common patterns and clues. And their investigation wasn't just some snapshot in time either. It covered a full 30 years of research. By looking at studies from 1993 all the way to 2023, they could see not just what we know now, but how our whole understanding of this has evolved over an entire generation. So after combing through all that evidence, what did they find? Well, they assembled something incredibly valuable, a blueprint. A really comprehensive model that explains the mechanics of how graduate student motivation actually works. They call it the Graduate Students Research Motivation Model, or GSRMM for short. And you can think of it as the master blueprint. For the first time, it pulls together all these different pieces of the puzzle into one single framework. It shows us the causes, the experience itself, and the effects of motivation. And the model itself, it works in 3 pretty simple steps. First, you got the triggers. These are all the factors that spark motivation, what the study calls antecedents. Second, you have the engine. That's motivation itself, the real driving force. And third, the results, the consequences of that motivation. Things like performance and creativity. Triggers, engine, results. Simple, right? But here's where it gets really interesting. This new blueprint doesn't just show us what we know. It also shines a great big spotlight on what we don't know. The investigation revealed some very specific blind spots in the current research landscape, and it revealed this clear divide between what you could call hot leads and cold cases. See, researchers have spent a ton of time studying the manipulable triggers, things universities can actually control, like supervisor support. But the cold cases, those are still way underexplored. Things like a student's personality or the long-term career impact of their motivation. The investigation also uncovered something else, something you see in a lot of investigations, actually. When it comes to studying motivation, researchers tend to rely on the same few usual suspects, a very specific set of tools and theories over and over again. So the primary investigative tool in the vast majority of these 57 studies is the self-report questionnaire. And while that's useful, the review found that its dominance, we're talking it captures around 85% of all the data, means we're getting a very specific and maybe a limited view of the problem. And what about the theory behind it all? Well, the single most dominant framework used to interpret all that data is self-efficacy theory, which is basically the idea that motivation is tied to a student's belief in their own ability to get the job done. It's a powerful lens, for sure, but the review suggests it might be the only lens a lot of researchers are using. You know, you don't even have to take my word for it. The researchers themselves state it plain as day in their conclusion. Their call to action is crystal clear. To solve the rest of this mystery, the field needs new investigative tools and has to move beyond its heavy reliance on questionnaires. So where does all this leave us? Well, the case of graduate student motivation definitely isn't closed. But thanks to this investigation, we have a much, much clearer picture of the crime scene, the key players, and most importantly, where to look next. All right, let's just quickly recap the key clues we've uncovered. First, we've got a brand new blueprint, the GSRM, that shows us how motivation works. Second, we learned that research is laser-focused on factors that universities can actually change. But that leaves these huge gaps in understanding things like personality and career outcomes. And finally, the whole field is leaning really heavily on just one main tool and one main theory. So, what's the bottom line here? What this all means is that our current understanding of graduate student motivation is really good, but its scope is surprisingly narrow. It's like for too long, we've been looking at this entire mystery through a tiny keyhole. It's time to open the door. And that brings us to a final question for you. Knowing that research has proven just how powerful those manipulative factors are, things like the environment and supervisor support, what's the one thing you would change in a graduate program to help solve this motivation mystery? Thanks for joining us on The Explainer.